the relentless heartbeat of Riverbridge, where ambition and anonymity clash daily, a single encounter could unravel the tightly woven facade of success. When Ethan Blake, a man poised to claim the pinnacle of corporate power, crosses paths with a seemingly invisible stranger, his world tilts on its axis. Little does he know, this fleeting moment will expose the chasm between privilege and humility, forcing him to confront the hidden truths that could redefine his life and his soul. What happens when the unseen holds the mirror to our truest selves? Riverbridge was a city that thrived on momentum. Its towering skyscrapers clawed at the gray sky, casting long shadows over the labyrinth of streets below. The rhythm of the city was relentless, a symphony of clacking heels, blaring horns, and murmured conversations. Amid the rush, the forgotten faces of the homeless lingered in the periphery, silent, invisible to the world that sped past them. Ethan Blake moved with purpose through the chaos, his tailored overcoat flaring slightly as he turned a corner. In his left hand he balanced a sleek leather briefcase, and in his right, an overpriced cup of dark roast coffee. His smartwatch beeped, reminding him he had 20 minutes to get to the office and finalize the presentation that could change everything. Today's meeting wasn't just another corporate gathering. It was his chance to secure the coveted vice president role at TechSpire Solutions. The cold wind bit at his face, but Ethan barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by figures and strategies, his lips moving slightly as he rehearsed his opening remarks. He didn't see the disheveled figure leaning against the wall ahead until it was too late. The collision was sudden. His coffee spilled, splattering across his pristine suit, and the cup tumbled to the ground. Ethan stumbled back, glaring at the woman who had caused the mishap. She was bundled in a patched coat, her face half hidden beneath a matted scarf. Her belongings, stuffed in a tattered backpack, lay scattered at her feet. "I'm sorry," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the street's din. Her hands trembled as she reached for her bag. Ethan's patience snapped. "Do you even realize how much this coffee costs?" He barked, his tone sharp enough to cut through the air. "You can't just stumble around ruining people's mornings." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, something unreadable flickered in their depths. Then she straightened, clutching her bag tightly. "Must be nice to afford such luxuries," she said softly, her words laced with quiet defiance. Ethan's face flushed with anger. Without thinking, he threw the remnants of his coffee at the ground near her feet. The liquid splashed onto her worn boots, and she stepped back, her expression unreadable. As she walked away, Ethan shook his head, muttering under his breath about carelessness. He didn't have time for this. He adjusted his suit and quickened his pace, oblivious to the eyes that had watched the exchange from the shadows. Ethan arrived at the TechSpire headquarters, a gleaming glass monolith that mirrored the bustling city around it. The warmth of the lobby was a welcome contrast to the bitter cold outside. He nodded curtly to the receptionist and stepped into the elevator, his mind already back on the upcoming presentation. A consult, but the encounter on the street lingered in the corners of his mind. Her words, "Must be nice to afford such luxuries," he played like an unwelcome refrain. He dismissed the thought with a shake of his head. "Focus," he muttered to himself. "This meeting is all that matters." By the time he reached the boardroom, Ethan had regained his composure. He was greeted by the murmurs of his colleagues and the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee. At the head of the table stood Sandra Cole, the CEO of TechSpire. Known for her unorthodox methods and sharp intuition, Sandra was both respected and feared. Ethan slid into his seat, ready to make his mark, but as Sandra began to speak, his breath caught. Her voice, calm yet commanding, carried a tone that immediately demanded attention. "Before we begin," she said, "I'd like to share an experience I had this morning." Her eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Ethan. She was wearing a patched coat and a matted scarf, the same outfit he'd seen just an hour ago. Ethan's stomach dropped. The blood drained from his face as realization struck. The homeless woman he had berated on the street was standing before him, no longer invisible, but the most powerful person in the room. Silence filled the boardroom as Sandra began recounting her morning. She described the coffee spill in vivid detail, the harsh words, and the indignity of being dismissed so easily. Her voice was calm, but each word carried weight, cutting deeper into Ethan with every syllable. "We conduct these little tests occasionally," Sandra said, removing the scarf and placing it neatly on the table. "Not to humiliate, but to understand, to see who my employees are when no one's watching." Her gaze locked onto Ethan. "This morning I saw someone who values his own convenience over another person's dignity, someone who acts without thinking about the consequences of his actions. Tell me, Mr. Blake, is that the kind of leader we need at TechSpire?" Ethan struggled to find his voice. "I didn't realize. If I had known..." Sandra cut him off with a raised hand. "Would it have mattered if you had known? Or is respect something you reserve for people you think can benefit you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Ethan's usual confidence was nowhere to be found. For the first time in years, he felt completely exposed. In the days that followed, Ethan could barely concentrate. Sandra's words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth about himself. He began noticing things he had long ignored. The janitor who cleaned his office late at night, the barista who always got his order right, the street vendors he hurried past without a second glance. Driven by guilt and a desire to change, Ethan visited a local shelter. The experience was humbling. He listened to stories of people who had lost everything but still found ways to keep going. He met a man who had once been a successful engineer but now struggled to find work, and a young woman who had been forced onto the streets after escaping an abusive home. Their resilience moved him in ways he couldn't articulate. Ethan began volunteering regularly, not out of obligation, but a genuine desire to make a difference. Slowly, he started to see the world through a lens of empathy, understanding the depth of struggles he had once dismissed as inconveniences. Several weeks later, Ethan was summoned to Sandra's office. He entered with a mix of trepidation and hope, unsure of what to expect. Sandra sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable. "I've been watching you," she began. "Not just in the boardroom, but outside these walls. I've seen the changes you've made. They're a start." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He realized how blind I've been. "I can't undo the past, but I'm trying to be better." Sandra leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Leadership isn't just about results, Ethan. It's about people. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, not just those who can help you climb the ladder." She handed him a folder. Inside was his promotion letter. "This isn't a reward," she said firmly. "It's a responsibility. Don't waste it." Ethan left her office feeling both humbled and hopeful. On his way home, he noticed a street vendor struggling to set up his cart in the biting wind. Without hesitation, Ethan stopped to help. The vendor thanked him, surprised, and Ethan simply smiled. It was a small gesture, but for Ethan, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by ambition, but by compassion and understanding.